The first thing you need to understand about Lieutenant Commander Astrid Phoenix Kovalenko is that she wasn't supposed to survive her first deployment. The second thing is that she wasn't supposed to make it through the academy. The third thing, and this is where the story gets interesting, is that she definitely wasn't supposed to be standing on the flight deck of the USS Constellation at 5:47 hours on a Tuesday morning in the South China Sea, watching Admiral Marcus Whitfield reach for her custom Barrett M82A1 with the kind of entitled swagger that had gotten better soldiers killed. The .50 caliber rifle wasn't regulation. Phoenix had earned it the hard way, pulling it off a Taliban sniper in Kandahar after a 3-day hunt through mountain caves that left her spotter dead, and her left shoulder permanently marked by shrapnel scars that looked like lightning when she moved wrong in the light. The weapon bore no serial numbers, only scratches that told stories she never shared at the officers' club. Whitfield's fingers were 2 inches from the rifle's grip when Phoenix moved. Not the quick, flashy movement of Hollywood heroics, but the precise, economical motion of someone who had learned that hesitation meant body bags. Her right hand caught his wrist with surgical precision, applying pressure to the exact nerve cluster that would send electric pain shooting up his arm without causing permanent damage, mostly. The Admiral's gasp cut through the morning sea air like a blade. Around them, deck crew members froze mid-task, their eyes wide with the sudden realization that they were witnessing something that would either end careers or become legend. The Constellation's twin reactors hummed beneath their feet, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to pause in anticipation. "Sir," Phoenix said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded either extraordinary violence or extraordinary restraint, "I'd recommend keeping your hands to yourself." Her grip tightened just enough to make her point clear. Whitfield's face flushed red beneath his perfectly maintained tan, the kind that came from golf courses rather than combat zones. What happened next would ripple through the Pacific Fleet like a depth charge, but to understand why Phoenix reacted the way she did, you need to understand what brought her to this moment. The daughter of Ukrainian immigrants who had fled Soviet oppression, she had grown up in Detroit watching her father work 16-hour shifts at the Ford plant while her mother cleaned office buildings at night. Excellence wasn't optional in the Kovalenko household. It was survival. The sky above the South China Sea stretched endless and gray, heavy with the weight of approaching monsoons. In 6 minutes, everything would change. Phoenix had joined the Navy not for glory or patriotism, but because the recruiter had promised her something her family had never possessed: stability. What she discovered instead was a world where her gender made her a curiosity, her ethnicity made her suspicious, and her competence made her dangerous to men who had never earned what they'd been given. The academy had been 4 years of proving herself twice as hard for half the recognition, of being called diversity hire by classmates whose fathers had purchased their appointments with campaign contributions. Flight school had been worse. The instructors seemed to take particular pleasure in washing out female candidates, creating impossible scenarios designed to break spirits rather than build pilots. Phoenix responded by becoming the best goddamn aviator any of them had ever seen. She could thread an FA-18 Super Hornet through a thunderstorm with instruments failing, land on a pitching carrier deck in 30-foot swells, and put ordnance on target with surgical precision that made senior officers uncomfortable with their own mediocrity. Her call sign hadn't come from some romantic notion about rising from ashes. It came from her first combat deployment in Afghanistan, when her wingman's aircraft had been shot down in the Hindu Kush Mountains. While the rescue coordinator ordered her to maintain altitude and wait for backup, Phoenix had ignored direct orders and descended into a valley that radar showed was crawling with enemy fighters. She found her wingman's wreckage and 2 Taliban squads converging on his position. What followed was 47 minutes of aerial combat that military historians would later compare to the legendary dogfights of World War II. Phoenix's Hornet danced through the mountain peaks like a ghost made of aluminum and fire, using terrain and weather to turn a desperate rescue into a masterclass of tactical aviation. She eliminated 6 enemy positions, extracted her wounded wingman, and returned to base with less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining. The official report credited her with exceptional airmanship under combat conditions. The unofficial legend spoke of something else entirely, a pilot who had looked death in the face and refused to blink. From that day forward, she was Phoenix, and the name carried weight in ready rooms from Pensacola to Pearl Harbor. But weight, she learned, wasn't the same as respect. Admiral Whitfield represented everything Phoenix had spent her career fighting against: inherited privilege dressed up in naval tradition. A man who had never heard a shot fired in anger, but felt entitled to everything she had bled to earn. His record showed a career built on political connections rather than combat effectiveness, staff positions in safe locations, while better officers died in places whose names he couldn't pronounce correctly. The morning sun climbed higher above the Constellation's flight deck, casting long shadows between the aircraft. FA-18 Super Hornets sat in perfect rows, their gray paint schemes designed to disappear against stormy skies. The smell of jet fuel and salt water mixed in the humid air, familiar scents that had become Phoenix's home more than any apartment she'd ever rented. This ship, these aircraft, this dangerous dance between sea and sky, this was where she belonged. But belonging, she had learned, was something you had to fight for every single day. And Admiral Whitfield, with his soft hands and harder assumptions about what women could and couldn't do in his Navy, had just made the mistake of treating her like she was still fighting for acceptance rather than defending what she had already earned. The silence stretched between them like a wire under tension. Phoenix could feel the eyes of every sailor within 50 feet, could sense the way conversations had died and work had stopped. This was the moment that would define not just her career, but the careers of every woman who would follow in her wake. She could release the Admiral's wrist, apologize for the misunderstanding, and spend the rest of her service being known as the officer who backed down when it mattered. Or she could stand her ground and face whatever consequences came with showing a flag officer that some lines couldn't be crossed. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. Phoenix had never backed down from anything that mattered, and she wasn't about to start now. Her grip on Whitfield's wrist shifted slightly, a subtle adjustment that sent a clear message. This wasn't negotiable. "Commander Kovalenko," Whitfield said through gritted teeth, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance, "you are relieving pressure on my wrist immediately, and then you are going to explain why you think you can lay hands on a flag officer." Phoenix's response came without hesitation, her voice carrying across the flight deck with crystalline clarity. "Sir, you were reaching for my weapon without permission. In a combat zone, that's considered a hostile act." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Technically, they were in international waters. Technically, the South China Sea qualified as a combat zone given recent Chinese naval activity. Technically, Phoenix was within her rights to defend her equipment from unauthorized access. Technically didn't mean Admiral Whitfield would see it that way. The sound that came from the Admiral's throat was something between a growl and a gasp. Around them, the flight deck had transformed into a theater where every sailor, every officer, every mechanic and deck crew member had suddenly found urgent tasks that required their complete attention, while somehow positioning themselves to witness whatever happened next. This was the kind of moment that generated sea stories that would be told for decades, the kind of confrontation that revealed who people really were when the pressure was on. Phoenix's peripheral vision caught movement near the island's superstructure. Commander Elena Vasquez, the ship's air boss, was approaching with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. Her face showed the calculated neutrality of a senior officer trying to prevent a career-ending incident while secretly rooting for the underdog. Vasquez had been in the Navy long enough to remember when women weren't allowed in combat roles. had fought her own battles against the same entitled mediocrity that Phoenix faced every day. "Gentlemen, ladies," Vasquez said as she reached the small crowd that had formed around the confrontation, her voice carrying the authority of someone responsible for the safe operation of one of the most dangerous workplaces on Earth. "Perhaps we could discuss whatever issue has arisen in a more appropriate setting." Admiral Whitfield turned his head toward Vasquez, his movement constrained by Phoenix's continued grip on his wrist. "Commander Vasquez, your subordinate has committed assault on a flag officer. I expect immediate disciplinary action." The words settled over the flight deck like a toxic cloud. Assault on a flag officer was a career-ending charge, the kind of accusation that would follow Phoenix into civilian life and beyond. But Vasquez had spent 22 years in the Navy by being smarter than the men who underestimated her, and she had seen the entire confrontation unfold from her position on the bridge. "Admiral," Vasquez said carefully, "from my vantage point, it appeared that Lieutenant Commander Kovalenko was preventing unauthorized access to a weapon system. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding about the nature of the interaction." The statement was a masterpiece of military diplomacy, technically accurate, carefully neutral, and subtly supportive of Phoenix's position. It also provided Admiral Whitfield with an opportunity to de-escalate the situation without losing face, a gift that Phoenix hoped he was smart enough to accept. But Admiral Whitfield had spent his career surrounded by subordinates who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know, and the concept of being corrected by junior officers, especially female junior officers, was foreign to his worldview. His free hand moved toward the radio clipped to his belt, a gesture that everyone present understood as a threat to escalate the situation to the ship's commanding officer. Phoenix felt the muscles in her forearm tense involuntarily. She had faced down enemy fighters over hostile territory, had made life-and-death decisions at Mach 1.5 while pulling 8 GS, had proven herself in every combat scenario the Navy could devise. But this moment, standing on the deck of her own ship facing an admiral whose ego had been wounded, felt more dangerous than anything she had encountered in combat zones. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had volunteered to put her life on the line defending American interests around the world, but the greatest threat to her career came from an American admiral who couldn't accept that a woman might be better at something than he was. The South China Sea stretched endlessly around them, its gray waters hiding Chinese submarines and surface vessels that posed real threats to American naval operations. Somewhere out there, genuine enemies were planning genuine attacks against American forces. But here on the flight deck of the USS Constellation, the most immediate danger came from wounded pride and institutional sexism wrapped in naval tradition. Phoenix's grip on Admiral Whitfield's wrist remained steady, her eyes locked on his with unwavering intensity. She had made her choice, and now she would face whatever consequences followed. But she would face them as herself. Lieutenant Commander Astrid Phoenix Kovalenko, naval aviator, combat veteran, and a woman who had earned her place in this man's Navy through blood, sweat, and excellence that her critics could never match. The morning sun continued its climb toward noon, indifferent to the human drama playing out on the carrier's deck. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, pregnant with the promise of turbulence to come. What Admiral Whitfield didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Phoenix's Barrett M82A1 wasn't just a trophy from Afghanistan. It was a tool that had saved American lives in ways that would never appear in official reports, a weapon that had been used in operations so classified that they existed only in the memories of operators who would take their secrets to the grave. The rifle represented more than marksmanship or combat prowess. It represented a commitment to mission success that transcended personal safety or career advancement. 3 months earlier, Phoenix had been deployed to a forward operating base in Syria, officially as a liaison officer coordinating close air support for Special Operations Forces. Unofficially, she had been there because her unique skill set made her invaluable for missions that required both aerial expertise and ground-level precision. The Barrett had been her constant companion during long nights of overwatch, protecting American forces from threats they would never see coming. The mission that had brought her back to the Constellation had been designated Operation Glass Mirror, a reconnaissance and interdiction operation targeting weapons shipments moving through the region. Phoenix had spent 14 hours in a prone position on a rocky ridge, watching through her rifle's scope as Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces prepared to transfer advanced anti-aircraft missiles to Hezbollah operatives. The intelligence she gathered during that operation had prevented those missiles from shooting down American aircraft over Lebanon. But Admiral Whitfield saw only a woman with a rifle that didn't belong to her, making demands he couldn't accept from someone he couldn't respect. The disconnect between perception and reality would have been almost comical if the consequences weren't so serious. Commander Vasquez moved closer to the confrontation, her body language radiating the calm authority of someone accustomed to preventing disasters before they occurred. "Admiral Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying just enough deference to avoid insubordination while maintaining the firmness necessary to get his attention. "Perhaps we could discuss the details of this incident in the privacy of my office. I'm sure Lieutenant Commander Kovalenko would be willing to provide a full explanation of the circumstances." The offer was elegant in its simplicity, a face-saving exit strategy that would allow all parties to de-escalate without admitting fault. Phoenix understood that accepting the offer would require her to release the Admiral's wrist and trust that military justice would prevail over personal vendetta. It was a calculated risk that could save her career or end it, depending on Whitfield's character and Vasquez's ability to manage the aftermath. For a moment that felt like eternity, nobody moved. The flight deck had become a stage where the future of military integration played out in microcosm, where the question of whether competence could overcome prejudice would be answered through the actions of three officers whose decisions would ripple through the fleet. Phoenix's training told her to accept the de-escalation, to trust the system that had promoted her through the ranks despite its flaws. Her instincts told her that releasing Admiral Whitfield's wrist would be seen as submission, that backing down now would validate every assumption about women's inability to stand firm under pressure. The contradiction between tactical wisdom and strategic necessity created a tension that she could feel in every muscle fiber. The decision came not from calculation but from something deeper, a recognition that this moment was bigger than her career, bigger than Admiral Whitfield's ego, bigger than the immediate consequences they all faced. This was about whether the Navy would be an institution that protected excellence or privilege, whether competence would be valued over connections, whether the women who followed in Phoenix's wake would have to fight the same battles she had been fighting for the past decade. She released Admiral Whitfield's wrist with the same precision she had used to grasp it, stepping back exactly one pace to create distance while maintaining her position near the Barrett. The movement was calculated to show respect for rank while refusing to show submission to unreasonable authority. Admiral Whitfield flexed his fingers, his face showing relief mixed with residual anger. The red marks on his wrist would fade within an hour, but the memory of being physically controlled by a subordinate officer would linger much longer. His eyes moved from Phoenix to the rifle and back again, as if trying to understand how the situation had escalated so quickly. "Commander Vasquez," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "I want a full report on this incident within the hour. And I want Lieutenant Commander Kovalenko to understand that her conduct today will be thoroughly reviewed." The words carried the weight of administrative threat, but they also represented a de-escalation from the immediate accusations of assault. Phoenix understood that she had won this battle while potentially losing the war. Admiral Whitfield would likely make her life difficult for the remainder of her deployment, but she had avoided immediate charges that could have ended her career. Commander Vasquez nodded with professional neutrality. Of course, Admiral. I'll ensure that all relevant factors are included in the report. The statement was carefully crafted to suggest that Whitfield's attempt to handle Phoenix's weapon would be documented alongside her response, a subtle reminder that his actions would also be subject to scrutiny. The crowd of sailors and officers that had gathered during the confrontation began to disperse with the practiced efficiency of military personnel who understood when a show was over. But Phoenix could feel their eyes on her as they moved away, could sense the mix of admiration and concern that her actions had generated. She had stood up to a flag officer and survived, but survival and victory weren't the same thing. As the flight deck returned to its normal rhythm of organized chaos, Phoenix remained standing near her rifle, her mind already calculating the political fallout from the morning's events. She had probably made an enemy of Admiral Whitfield, but she had also demonstrated to every sailor on the ship that some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. The question now was whether that demonstration would inspire or isolate her in the battles to come. The storm clouds on the horizon had grown darker during the confrontation, and Phoenix could smell rain in the salt air. Weather was coming, the kind of weather that would test every skill she had developed as a naval aviator. But for the first time in months, she looked forward to the challenge. Flying through storms was straightforward compared to navigating the political turbulence she had just created. Admiral Whitfield's departure from the flight deck was performed with the dignity expected of his rank, but Phoenix noticed the slight stiffness in his movements that suggested his wrist was still bothering him. She felt no satisfaction in his discomfort. Causing pain had never been the objective. The objective had been establishing boundaries, and in that regard, she believed she had succeeded. The Barrett sat in its case exactly where she had left it, unchanged by the drama that had swirled around it. The rifle had been the catalyst for the confrontation, but Phoenix understood that the real issue had been respect. Specifically, Admiral Whitfield's inability to extend it to someone who had earned it through means he couldn't appreciate. The weapon represented her competence, her combat experience, her right to be treated as an equal in an institution that had historically treated her as an interloper. Commander Vasquez approached as the last of the crowd dispersed, her expression unreadable in the way that senior officers perfected through years of managing difficult situations. "Phoenix," she said quietly, using the call sign rather than rank in a gesture of informal support. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. I haven't decided which." Phoenix met Vasquez's gaze directly, recognizing in the older officer's eyes the wisdom that came from fighting similar battles in an earlier era. "Commander, respectfully, I don't think those are mutually exclusive categories." The response drew a slight smile from Vasquez, the kind of expression that suggested shared understanding between warriors who had faced different versions of the same enemy. "Fair point. But you need to understand that Admiral Whitfield has friends in the Pentagon, friends who won't appreciate the story that's about to spread through the fleet. You've made a statement today, but statements have consequences." Phoenix nodded, acknowledging the truth in Vasquez's warning. She had always understood that excellence wasn't enough in the Navy. Politics mattered, connections mattered, and the ability to manage personalities mattered just as much as the ability to fly aircraft or hit targets. But she had also learned that sometimes political considerations had to be secondary to more fundamental principles. "Commander," Phoenix said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had made her reputation as a pilot, "I've been dealing with consequences my entire career. The difference is that today's consequences came from standing up for something that matters, rather than backing down from something that doesn't." The words hung between them like a challenge to the system they both served, a recognition that institutional change sometimes required individual sacrifice. Vasquez understood the truth in Phoenix's statement, but she also understood the practical realities of military careers and the ways that principled stands could become Pyrrhic victories. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Chief Petty Officer Marcus Torres, the senior enlisted advisor whose job included knowing everything that happened on the flight deck before it became a problem for the officers. Torres had been in the Navy for 18 years, had served on 6 different ships, and had developed an intuitive understanding of when situations were about to get complicated. "Begging your pardon, Commander," Torres said to Vasquez, his tone carrying the respectful authority of a senior enlisted man addressing an officer. "But there's been some chatter on the radio nets about this morning's incident. Word is getting around fast, and there are some questions about the next steps." Vasquez accepted the information with the weary resignation of someone who understood that naval communications systems were only slightly more secure than ships' gossip networks. "What kind of chatter, Chief?" Torres glanced at Phoenix before responding, his expression suggesting both respect for her actions and concern for her future. "The kind that suggests people are taking sides, Commander. Some folks are saying Lieutenant Commander Kovalenko was out of line. Others are saying it was about time somebody stood up to—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Well, to the kind of leadership that doesn't appreciate what it's got." The diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the underlying message. Phoenix had become a symbol in a larger conflict between old-school naval tradition and the evolving reality of an integrated military. Her confrontation with Admiral Whitfield had crystallized tensions that had been building throughout the fleet, turning a personal dispute into a referendum on military culture. Phoenix felt the weight of unwanted symbolism settling on her shoulders like a heavy pack. She had never wanted to be a poster child for women's rights in the military. She had simply wanted to be a naval aviator who was judged by her performance rather than her gender. But the choice between being a symbol and being a victim wasn't really a choice at all. The afternoon sun climbed higher above the constellation, its heat beginning to make the flight deck shimmer with rising thermals. Phoenix could see storm clouds building on the horizon, the kind of weather system that would challenge every pilot on the ship in the hours to come. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. She had helped create a storm that would test everyone caught in its path. But storms, she reminded herself, were also opportunities. They revealed character, sorted the competent from the merely confident, and cleared the air of accumulated tensions. Whatever came next, Phoenix was confident in her ability to navigate through it. She had been flying through storms her entire career, and this one, for all its political complexity, wouldn't be the one that finally brought her down. The sound of jet engines spooling up drew her attention to the far end of the flight deck, where maintenance crews were preparing aircraft for the afternoon's training flights. Soon, she would be back in her natural element, alone in the cockpit of an FA-18 Super Hornet with nothing but sky and mission objectives to worry about. The clean simplicity of flight operations would be a welcome relief from the messy complexity of human politics. But first, she had reports to write, explanations to give, and consequences to face. Admiral Whitfield's threat of a thorough review meant that every aspect of her career would be scrutinized, every decision questioned, every achievement measured against impossible standards of political correctness. She had faced that kind of scrutiny before and survived. She would face it again with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every previous challenge. Commander Vasquez was already moving toward the island's superstructure, her body language suggesting urgent business that couldn't wait. Chief Torres lingered for a moment longer, his expression conveying the kind of unspoken support that senior enlisted personnel offered to officers they respected. "Lieutenant Commander," Torres said quietly, his words meant for Phoenix alone, "for what it's worth, there are a lot of sailors on this ship who think you did the right thing today. Sometimes doing the right thing is more important than doing the safe thing." The words carried more weight than Torres probably realized. In a military culture that often rewarded conformity over courage, the support of senior enlisted personnel was both rare and valuable. These were the men and women who made the Navy actually function, whose opinions carried more practical weight than the formal authority of commissioned officers. Phoenix nodded her acknowledgement of Tor's support, understanding that his words represented more than personal approval. They suggested that her actions had resonated with the Navy's backbone, the experienced professionals who judged competence by results rather than politics. That support would matter in the battles to come. As Torres departed to resume his duties, Phoenix found herself alone on the flight deck for the first time since the confrontation began. The Barrett M82A1 sat in its case beside her, a silent witness to the morning's events and a reminder of the skills that had brought her to this moment. She had carried this rifle through hostile territory, had used it to protect American lives in situations that would never be acknowledged in official records. The weapon represented more than marksmanship. It represented the commitment to excellence that had defined her entire military career. Every shot she had fired, every mission she had flown, every challenge she had overcome had been in service of a simple principle. Americans deserved defenders who were willing to sacrifice everything for mission success. Admiral Whitfield's attempt to treat her equipment as his personal property had been an attack on that principle, and her response had been in defense of everything she held sacred. The storm clouds were closer now, their dark mass promising the kind of weather that would ground most aircraft and challenge even the most experienced pilots. Phoenix looked forward to the challenge. Flying through storms had taught her more about aviation than any classroom instruction, had forced her to develop the kind of instinctive skills that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. But the storm approaching from Admiral Whitfield's direction would be different, a political tempest that couldn't be navigated through skill and training alone. That storm would test her character, her resilience, and her ability to maintain her principles under pressure that had nothing to do with enemy fire or mechanical failure. It would be the most dangerous mission of her career, and she would have to fly it without instruments, without backup, and without the clear objectives that made military operations comprehensible. The thought should have been intimidating, but Phoenix felt only a familiar calm settling over her like a well-worn flight suit. She had been preparing for this mission her entire life, had been building the skills and relationships and reputation that would carry her through the turbulence ahead. Admiral Whitfield might have superior rank and better connections, but Phoenix had something more valuable, the respect of professionals who judged performance rather than politics. The afternoon sun reached its zenith above the South China Sea, casting sharp shadows across the Constellation's flight deck. Somewhere in the ship's administrative spaces, reports were being written, phone calls were being made, and careers were being decided by people who had never heard a shot fired in anger. But here on the flight deck, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the endless possibility of sky, Phoenix felt the quiet confidence that came from knowing she had done the right thing for the right reasons. Whatever Admiral Whitfield had planned for her, whatever bureaucratic obstacles he placed in her path, whatever political consequences followed from this morning's confrontation, she would face them all with the same unwavering determination that had carried her through every previous challenge. She was Lieutenant Commander Astrid Phoenix Kovalenko, naval aviator and combat veteran, and she had earned her place in this Navy through excellence that no amount of political maneuvering could diminish. The storm was coming, but Phoenix had been flying through storms her entire career. This one wouldn't be the one that finally brought her down. 6 hours after the confrontation, Phoenix sat in the ship's legal office facing Commander Patricia Hayes, the staff judge advocate whose job included untangling the kind of administrative messes that arose when junior officers physically restrained flag officers. Hayes was a former surface warfare officer who had transitioned to legal specialization, bringing to her new role both operational credibility and a sharp understanding of military law. The office was small and efficiently organized, its walls covered with framed legal documents and photographs from Hayes's previous assignments. The only personal touch was a small American flag that had flown over the courthouse in her hometown, a reminder of the civilian legal system that paralleled the military justice she now administered. Lieutenant Commander Kovalenko, Hayes began, her voice carrying the neutral professionalism of someone trained to separate facts from emotions. I've received Admiral Whitfield's report of this morning's incident. I'd like to hear your version of events before we proceed with any formal action. Phoenix had spent the intervening hours preparing for this moment, organizing her thoughts and reviewing the regulations that governed both her actions and Admiral Whitfield's. Military law was clear about the unauthorized handling of weapons systems, but it was equally clear about the appropriate channels for addressing grievances with superior officers. "Commander Hayes," Phoenix replied, matching the legal officer's professional tone, "Admiral Whitfield attempted to handle my personal weapon without permission or apparent cause. I prevented him from doing so using minimal necessary force, consistent with security protocols for controlled equipment." Hayes made notes on a legal pad, her pen moving with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to translating complex situations into legal language. "The Admiral characterizes your actions as assault on a flag officer. How would you respond to that characterization?" The question went to the heart of the matter, whether Phoenix's physical intervention could be legally justified given the circumstances. Military law provided some protection for personnel defending equipment and installations, but those protections had never been tested in a situation involving flag officer authority. Phoenix had anticipated this line of questioning and had prepared her response carefully. "Commander, if a sailor attempted to handle my weapon without authorization, preventing that handling would be considered proper security procedure. The regulations don't include exceptions based on the rank of the person attempting unauthorized access." It was a carefully crafted argument that focused on procedure rather than personality, regulation rather than respect. Hayes understood the legal elegance of the position. By framing her actions in terms of security protocol, Phoenix was claiming that she had been following established procedures rather than defying legitimate authority. But Hayes also understood the practical realities of military politics and the ways that legal correctness didn't always translate to career survival. "Lieutenant Commander, while your interpretation of security regulations may have merit, the practical question is whether physical force was necessary to address the situation. Could you have achieved the same result through verbal communication?" The question forced Phoenix to confront the fundamental choice she had made, whether to trust verbal de-escalation or rely on physical intervention. In retrospect, she might have been able to prevent Admiral Whitfield from handling her weapon through firm but respectful objection. But in the moment, faced with a flag officer whose body language suggested he would not accept refusal, physical intervention had seemed like the only reliable option. "Commander," Phoenix said after a moment of consideration, "Admiral Whitfield was reaching for my weapon despite my verbal objection. Given his rank and apparent determination, I assessed that continued verbal protest would be ineffective. I chose the minimum force necessary to prevent unauthorized access to controlled equipment." Hayes continued making notes, her expression revealing nothing about her assessment of Phoenix's justifications. The legal officer had handled dozens of similar cases during her career, had seen how good officers could make career-ending mistakes through momentary lapses in judgment or political awareness. Her job was to determine whether Phoenix's actions constituted such a mistake or represented reasonable responses to an unusual situation. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of Hayes's pen and the distant hum of the ship's ventilation systems. Phoenix used the quiet moment to study the legal officer's face, searching for clues about how her explanation was being received. Hayes's expression remained professionally neutral, but Phoenix detected something in her posture that suggested at least grudging respect for the complexity of the situation. "Lieutenant Commander," Hayes said finally, looking up from her notes, "I've reviewed Admiral Whitfield's service record and yours. The contrast is illuminating. His operational experience is limited, while yours includes multiple combat deployments and commendations for exceptional performance under fire. That context will be relevant to any formal proceedings. The statement was carefully phrased to avoid direct criticism of a flag officer, but its implications were clear. Hayes had done her homework and understood that this confrontation represented more than a simple dispute over weapon handling. The legal officer was signaling that she recognized the broader issues at stake: competence versus connections, operational credibility versus administrative authority, and the fundamental question of how the Navy should balance respect for rank with recognition of merit. Phoenix felt a moment of cautious optimism. Commander Hayes's willingness to consider operational context suggested that the legal review might focus on facts rather than politics, on regulations rather than rank. But Phoenix had been in the Navy long enough to understand that hope and reality didn't always align, especially when flag officers felt their authority had been challenged. "Commander Hayes," Phoenix said, choosing her words with the same precision she used when calling in close air support, "I want to emphasize that I have tremendous respect for the institution of naval leadership and the importance of maintaining proper command relationships. My actions this morning were not motivated by disrespect for Admiral Whitfield's rank, but by concern for maintaining proper weapons security protocols." The statement was designed to demonstrate her understanding of military hierarchy, while maintaining her position that security procedures took precedence over personal preferences, regardless of rank. It was a delicate balance between showing appropriate respect and refusing to concede that her actions were inappropriate. Hayes finished her notes and set down her pen, her body language suggesting that the formal portion of the interview was concluding. "Lieutenant Commander, I'll be conducting interviews with the other personnel who witnessed this morning's events. Commander Vasquez, Chief Torres, and several others have agreed to provide statements. Once I have all the relevant information, I'll prepare a report with recommendations for the commanding officer." The mention of witness interviews was both encouraging and concerning for Phoenix. Commander Vasquez and Chief Torres had both shown support for her position during the incident, but their willingness to provide formal statements that might contradict a flag officer's report remained to be seen. Military witnesses often discovered sudden memory lapses when asked to testify about politically sensitive events. But Phoenix had learned to hope for the best while preparing for the worst. If her witnesses provided honest accounts of the morning's events, the legal review might vindicate her actions and establish important precedents for future situations. If political pressure influenced their testimony, she would face the consequences with the same stoic determination that had carried her through every previous challenge. "Thank you, Commander Hayes," Phoenix said, standing as the interview concluded. "I appreciate your thorough approach to this matter, and I'm confident that a complete review of the facts will support the appropriateness of my actions." Hayes stood as well, her expression showing the kind of professional respect that one competent officer extended to another. "Lieutenant Commander, off the record, I want you to know that I understand the position you were in this morning. Command relationships are complicated, and sometimes doing the right thing creates difficult consequences. Whatever my official recommendations, I want you to know that your service record speaks for itself." The unofficial vote of confidence meant more to Phoenix than Hayes probably realized. In a military culture that often valued conformity over conscience, the support of legal professionals carried special weight. These were the officers responsible for ensuring that military justice remained both military and just, whose opinions helped shape the institutional culture that determined whether competence or connections ultimately mattered more. As Phoenix left the